The wind came down off the Bridger Mountains that evening like it had somewhere to be, rattling the chinks in the log walls and pushing the smell of pine and distant snow through the open door. Elias Caldwell stood on the porch of the little cabin he'd built with his own hands 10 years earlier, one boot heel hooked on the lower rail, watching the last light bleed out of the sky over the Gallatin Valley. His hat was tilted low, the brim curled from years of sweat and sun, and the lines around his eyes had deepened since spring. He was 32, but some days the weight made him feel older. Inside, Abigail rocked by the stove, humming low, the baby tucked against her breast under the wool blanket she'd sewn from an old army coat. Hannah was 3 weeks old today, small enough that Elias still worried he'd break her if he held her too long. Abigail didn't have that fear. She carried the child like she'd been born doing it, like the years of waiting and bleeding and praying had all been leading to this one quiet moment. Elias heard the creak of the rocker stop. Abigail's voice drifted out, soft but clear enough to cut through the wind. "You gonna stand out there all night? Are you coming in before she starts crying for her daddy?" He smiled without meaning to. That was Abigail. Never harsh, but never one to let him drift too far into his own head. He pushed off the rail and stepped inside. The cabin was one big room with a loft, warm from the iron stove and smelling of coffee and milk and the sage Abigail burned to keep the mosquitoes down. A single kerosene lamp glowed on the table, throwing gold over the rough-hewn walls. He hung his hat on the peg by the door and crossed the floor in 3 long strides. Abigail looked up at him, tired but steady, her brown hair coming loose from its braid. There were new lines by her mouth too, but they looked good on her, like marks earned fair and square. "She eat?" he asked. "Like a little wolf," Abigail said. "You should have seen her go after it. I swear she's already got your stubborn chin." Elias crouched beside the rocker, resting one hand on the arm and the other on the blanket over Hannah's back. The baby made a small sound, half sigh, half grunt, and turned her face toward the heat of his palm. Her lashes were so long they brushed his skin. "Hey, little girl," he whispered. "You keep growing on us like that, we're gonna need a bigger cabin." Abigail laughed quietly. "We'll add on come spring. You promised." "I did," he said. "And I keep my promises." That was true. 10 years ago he'd promised her a home when they had nothing but a wagon, 2 mules, and a claim on 80 acres of sage and rock. He'd promised her children when the first 2 pregnancies ended in silence and blood that soaked the quilts black. He'd promised her he'd never leave, even when the winter of 21 took half the herd and the bank started sending letters with red seals. He kept every promise the way other men kept rifles, clean, loaded, ready. But promises were heavy things, and some nights he felt them pressing on his chest like stones. He stood up, restless. "I rode the north fence today. Found where the elk broke through again. Gonna have to ride out at dawn, reset the posts before the snow flies." Abigail watched him, eyes sharp. "You've been riding every fence 3 times a week since she was born. The cattle ain't going anywhere, Elias." "It ain't the cattle," he said, then stopped. He rubbed the back of his neck, feeling the grit of the day still on his skin. She waited. Abigail was good at waiting. "It's just." He looked toward the dark window. "I keep thinking about my daddy. How he lost this place in 93 when the silver crashed. How he put a bullet in his head out back of the barn and left Ma with 6 kids and a mortgage. I keep thinking, what if I'm him? What if I fail you the same way?" The words hung in the air like smoke. Abigail set the rocker still. Carefully she shifted Hannah to her shoulder, patting the baby's back with the slow rhythm that always calmed her. Then she looked at him straight. "Your daddy was a drunk who bet on mines that never paid," she said. "You're a man who gets up before God and works till the stars come out. You carry this family on your back every single day and you never once complained. That's not failing, Elias Caldwell. That's winning, slow and ugly as it is." He swallowed hard. Sometimes her certainty scared him more than his fear. Hannah let out a small cry. Elias reached for her without thinking, and Abigail let him take her. The baby weighed almost nothing, warm and damp and smelling of milk. He settled her against his chest, one big hand spanning her whole back, and she quieted instantly, tiny fist curling against his shirt. Abigail stood and moved behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist, her cheek between his shoulder blades. "We're not them," she murmured into his shirt. Were us. And we've got her now. Look at her, Elias. Look what we made. He did. In the lamplight, Hannah's face was flushed and perfect, lips pursed like she was dreaming of milk. Something cracked open in his chest, something that had been clenched tight since the day the midwife told them the bleeding had stopped and the heartbeat was still there. Outside, the first snow of the season started to fall, fat silent flakes drifting past the window. Inside, the stove popped and settled. Elias felt Abigail's breath steady against his back, felt the small trusting weight of his daughter rising and falling with his own breath. I love you, he said, rough. He didn't say it often. Words like that always felt too small for what he meant, but tonight they came easy. I know, Abigail answered. I never doubted it. They stood like that a long time, 3 hearts beating under one roof, while the Montana night wrapped the cabin in white. Come morning, the snow was only a dusting, gone by noon under a hard, clear sun. Elias rode out anyway, because fences don't fix themselves and winter waits for no man. But he came back earlier than usual, unsaddled the mare, and spent the afternoon splitting kindling while Abigail hung diapers on the line and Hannah slept in a crate by the stove. That evening he carried the rocker out onto the porch so Abigail could watch the sunset while she nursed. He sat on the steps below her, whittling a tiny pine horse for a child who wouldn't play with it for years. When the baby dozed off, Abigail laid her in the crook of Elias's arm and leaned her head on his shoulder. The valley stretched out gold and endless, the mountains turning purple in the distance. Somewhere a coyote yipped, and the wind carried the faint jingle of a neighbor's wind chimes miles away. We're gonna be all right, Elias said. It wasn't a question this time. Abigail threaded her fingers through his. Better than all right, she said. We're home. And for the first time in a long while, Elias believed it down to the bone. Years later, when Hannah brought her own children to that same porch and asked why her daddy still got quiet sometimes looking out at the mountains, Abigail would tell them the truth. Because he remembers the night he decided we were worth fighting for. And every day after that, he kept choosing us. But that night, with the snow long melted and the cabin warm and the 3 of them tangled together like they'd never be apart, none of them needed words. The land was hard and the winters harder, but the cabin held. Their hands found each other in the dark. And outside, the stars over Montana burned steady and ancient, keeping watch over a family that had learned how to stay.